Today you're going to see the secret behind Michelangelo and his work. Yes, we're going to be looking at the works that he was looking at. It's hidden in plain sight. It's all there in this first picture. Okay, so today's class, for those of you who have glanced at the schedule, you may have noticed that the second class is not the one that's on the schedule. Actually, the second and the third class lectures have been combined as the third lecture. So that's what we're looking at today. The title is The Monumental Style, Italy 1300 to 1500, or The Antecedents of Michelangelo. So, we begin, of course, with Vasari. We've glanced at this painting. We're not going to spend too much time on this painting. Simply to reiterate, the mystery of what Vasari was up to, why he chose to do what he did, is not exhausted by the surviving documentation. So there is some circumstantial evidence, which I think is fairly strong, given that the first person he showed his first version of the work to was Michelangelo, and Michelangelo wrote a poem to celebrate his achievement, that we're looking at a project which was probably initiated by Michelangelo, that Vasari carried out, which is to say, Michelangelo himself, as you can tell from his work, both directly and indirectly, and from some of his sketches, was deeply interested in his artistic predecessors. So that's what we're looking at today. Beginning with Cimabue. So Cimabue is very much the boundary figure. He's most well known for this work. It was painted sometime in the 1280s, 1287, 1288. And this is the famous crucifix which was destroyed in the floods of 1966. So there's what it looks like today. Sadly, this is a work that also by Cimabue, just slightly earlier. It's entitled The Majesty, or Virgin Enthroned with Six Angels. And this work clearly, I hope you can see from the images I've shown you in the first two classes, is channeling the East Roman, or as we tend to call today, the Byzantine. And Cimabue also worked in mosaic. He's not responsible for the central mosaic in the apse in Pisa, but for the St. John on the right-hand side. So something of his revolutionary style, doesn't look too revolutionary to us, is beginning to peek through here. However, Vasari believed that Giotto was a student of Cimabue's and comes out of his atelier. Whether this is historically factual or not, sadly we don't know enough to be able to confirm it. But here is a crucifix by Giotto, and here you see them side by side. 30 years separate them. The 30 years on either side of the year 1300 AD. And so how would we define the change? Anybody? Oh yeah, it's 30 years earlier, but it's already moving in this direction, as you'll see. Here is a crucifix from the East, from Byzantium, that's roughly contemporary. So naturalism, I think, is a good, safe word rather than realism. But what is carrying the naturalism is a desire to show the human body as existing three-dimensionally in space. You can see that? There's a kind of hint of naturalism on the left on Cimabue's crucifix, but it's highly stylized to the point of being expressionistic. When you look at the Byzantine icon, it itself is clearly expressionistic, although with a certain measure of realism, going all the way back to elements of it really go back to Roman times in the first century BC and the first century AD. And here we have Giotto again, his Virgin surrounded by angels. It's from 1310. And if we compare the two, I think the change is highlighted somewhat dramatically, right? The figures on the right are both monumental, and their monumentality comes from an implied three-dimensionality. The space that they occupy is not very deep, but even there, if you look at the Cimabue, the throne is shown usually in the kind of collapsed perspective of the Roman, really. Whereas here, there is an implied one-point perspective in the Aedicula throne that the Madonna is sitting on in the Cimabue. Okay, now, Giotto, this is about 5 years earlier. This is from the Arena Chapel, his famous image of the Kiss of Judas, around 1304, 1305. And here clearly the human body is being conjured up both three-dimensionally and also actively. You know, there's a lot of aggressive action going on here. Likewise with the Lamentation from the same series, although iconographically this one is a lot closer to the East Roman iconography. Here is, this is from the previous century, Byzantine image from the monastery of St. Panteleimon in today's Macedonia of around 1164. Deeply expressionistic, even though it's very clearly stylized. It represents one of the 12th century styles that emerged out of Constantinople. So, there is something behind this change. Change doesn't happen out of nowhere. Clearly, there's a desire for a greater degree of engagement with the stories that are embodied in these images. But the way this is manifest, in fact, doesn't come from painting. Its origins are sculpture. This is a contemporary sculpture by a sculptor from a sculpture atelier and family from Pisa. He's known as Giovanni from Pisa, or otherwise known as Giovanni Paisano. And this is one of his late works. It's from a pulpit that he sculpted in, not in Pisa itself, but in Pistoia. So, not only is the story here very charged, but the way the bodies are shown both three-dimensionally and compressed is a tradition that at the end of the 13th century, these artists were looking back at the Romans. Here is a fabulous late 2nd century sarcophagus, a Roman sarcophagus for one of Marcus Aurelius's generals, and this is the tradition that they're channeling. They're looking with fresh eyes in the late Gothic period at this kind of iconic representation and translating it both using Christian stories and also with Giotto into the painterly realm. So there you see Paesano's original work in Pistoia. It's an ambo, as you call it today, or a lectern. How do you get up there? Ladder. So you have to bring a ladder to it. There isn't a permanent way to get up there. Okay, so Giotto, again, this is one of his last works, his crucifixion panel on wood that's currently in a museum in Berlin. So, let's look briefly a little bit more closely at the base. This kind of representation of crowds is something that is quite new. Again, to compare, there is actually a late Byzantine icon from Russia, where the tendency is to move more in the direction of the linear and the deeply stylized and expressive, although still channeling Roman drapery, as you can see. But it's restricted to a small group of figures, unlike the Giotto. Now, it's not that the Eastern Roman work is not expressive, but it has stabilized into a style that is very much operating as the mean between both composition, stylization, and a certain degree of naturalism that is highly charged emotionally at the same time. So that is the mixture of elements that are being taken in a new direction in this work, coming out of central Italy, largely the region of Tuscany, Siena, and Florence. And here we look at two crucifixions, an earlier crucifixion from the Arena Chapel, and a close-up of the Christ, and a later crucifixion from the lower church in Assisi. You can tell that by all these Franciscans on the lower right, where the direction of his work is clearly seen here. So that for the bodies to have this naturalism and to exist three-dimensionally, he has to conquer more and more three-dimensional space as well. And that is visible both in the crucified figure of Christ between these two, and especially in the witnesses at the foot of the cross. To give you a context of these paintings, the earlier ones in the Arena Chapel, there you see the crucifixion that we were looking at. There you see the wall more elevationally. We also saw the Lamentation, and now we're going to look at this painting. So, as I mentioned, if you're going to show bodies three-dimensionally, you have to actually carve out space for them. The collapsed space of the high relief to middle relief Roman sarcophagi are not really a comfortable space in painting, and so Giotto begins to create what look for all the world like stage sets, And these look like actors on a very compressed stage. Do you all see that? Actors, compressed stage. And to make these stages more persuasive, he begins to operate in a kind of quasi-realistic perspective, which is to say it's not geometrically analytical, but at least all the parallel lines are more or less going in the same direction, rather than the conflicting directions that you see in Roman wall painting and in so-called Byzantine painting, later Roman painting. There's much that can and should be said about this, but we'll leave it for later. And here's an overall view of the Arena Chapel, a fabulous work in Padua. So, this style that Giotto began is carried forward through the rest of the 14th into the 15th century, both directly by artists coming out of his studio. This is towards the end of the 14th century. Agnolo Gaddi, who is the son of another Gaddi, Taddeo Gaddi, who was himself a pupil of Giotto. So this is an artistic lineage coming out of one studio. Now, here, they've reverted to an iconic style. Against the gold, the abstract gold ground, you have these very Giotto-esque three-dimensional figures, but the space that they occupy has been abstracted away. You can see that, right? And this tends to allow them to operate in a more acceptable religious context. So, this wasn't the rest of Europe, though. And here we have this fabulous image from Germany by an artist known as Konrad von Soest. It's around 1403, so on the threshold of the next century. And basically what happened throughout Europe by way of southern France was something that is known by the art historians as International Gothic. There's a close-up of the central panel. These are all paintings that are set up on top of altars. They're all devotional paintings. So, the International Gothic is very devotional in its intent, but clearly channeling both the more volumetric representation of the human figure that Giotto began in the earliest part of the previous century, plus having dealing with large groups of figures in a more abstract compositional fashion. In other words, they're not all standing on the same ground, obviously, and they're not all occupying a coherent single space. And one of the key figures in this transformation is a painter from Siena known as Simone Martini. He is from the earlier part of the 14th century, and this is his fabulous icon of the Annunciation that currently lives in the Uffizi. There's a close-up of it. So, much has reverted to a more Byzantine stylization, however, with the more flowing lines of the High Gothic, as you can see. But the hands and the faces are operating much more in this naturalistic style. It's a beautifully integrated work that brings all these different elements together. He went to Avignon through most of the 14th century. I'll touch on this in a few minutes. The papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon, and so artists, writers, bureaucrats, politicians tended to congregate in southern France at Avignon, and that was the place where this International Gothic style was diffused from. And it traveled far. This is a fabulous diptych from England. It's called the Wilton Diptych because it currently lives in Wilton House. And it's from the late 14th century. On the left-hand side, you see the very young new king, Richard II, the heir to Edward III. His father was a famous Black Prince who sadly predeceased Edward III. This is the period of the wars, the so-called 100 Years' War, the attempt by the Norman English to conquer France, which, as you know, was ultimately defeated by Saint Joan of Arc. So, let's look more closely. Yeah. So, I'm going to take a look way forward here. Richard II is the subject of Shakespeare's earliest historical play, and it was his deposition and murder that was the catalyst with that trajectory in English history that ultimately gave us Henry VIII and Elizabeth and the Protestant Reformation. Now, some of you may know this, most of you probably don't, but this is the real Shakespeare's Family, his daughter. This is a fantastic painting by Anthony van Dyck at Pembroke House, representing the 4th Earl of Pembroke. The 4th Earl of Pembroke and his brother are the two patrons of the First Folio, which was the complete publication of all of Shakespeare's surviving plays. Shakespeare, of course, is the 17th Earl of Oxford, and this is his daughter, who has, sadly, as you can see, she doesn't inhabit the same world as the other figures in the painting. She's been recently deceased, and she's shown much more iconically, and here are his two grandsons. Okay. However, this is the world we are approaching beyond Michelangelo, obviously. Entirely new, painterly, iconic, and also spiritually and culturally world. This is the painting in its extraordinary room, and here you see the room in natural light, which is how it was originally designed to be experienced. So this painting was made for this room, and this room for this painting. Anyhow, this is a plug for an alternate Game of Thrones. The BBC has produced 6 of Shakespeare's historical plays as an unfolding film series, and they come very strongly recommended. Incredible actors, and they're not filmed on stage, so they're filmed as if they're movies. Those of you who've seen Henry V with Brunelleschi will have a sense of the virtues of presenting Shakespeare in this way. And you all recognize this guy, right? What is his most famous contemporary role now? Sherlock Holmes, right? Anyhow, he is actually a Plantagenet by ancestry. His ancestors go back to the royal family that ruled England until the Tudors. So, we're going to say goodbye to the Middle Ages. That was a brief look back at the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is embodied in their early Renaissance form by the the King Arthur tales. Okay, however, another agent of change who in many ways straddles both worlds, although most of the time he's looked at as the culmination of the culture, the religious culture, as well as the overall ethos of the Middle Ages is Dante, of course. It's beautiful how he's shown in this painting on the edge, as it were, looking in. It alludes to his exile. Now, Dante was fully engaged in the life of Florence to the point that because of his affiliations with various competing groups, when his party was banished from Florence, he was banished from Florence, and his great work is a product of the years of his banishment. It was written in the last 12 years of his life. And here's a lovely painting by Delacroix from the early 19th century, showing Dante and his guide to the first two-thirds of his journey, both into Hades and then up through purgatory towards paradise. Okay, so a little bit of context. When Dante was engaged in the politics that would shortly get him exiled from Florence, this was Florence. Florence was one of many, many tiny principalities in northern Italy. Florence and all these other tiny places, including, actually the most powerful at this point was probably the Republic of Venice, was the beneficiary of what I was beginning to introduce in the last two lectures and alluding to the struggle for authority and power in this world between the Holy Roman Emperors situated in Germany and the papacy. Now, because the context was somewhat evenly balanced, it allowed other players to use this, to basically change allegiances, once going with the Pope, another time going with the Emperor, to carve out a certain measure of independence for themselves. And by the year, this process began before 1200, but by the year 1300 AD, a whole actually an astonishing number of quasi-independent city-states had erupted, largely in northern Italy, but actually throughout Germany and even in the east in the Hanseatic League, in what would become Prussia and the Baltic states. And even the papal realm. Why was Julius II constantly at war? He was trying to subdue his independent subjects who always tended towards a greater degree of autonomy and independence. Okay. Now, what this gives us in having so many competing centers of authority is a fabulously fertile ground, as it were, a crucible for the cultural explosion, which is the Renaissance. Think about it this way. Lots of patrons for artists. And if you don't get along with one of them, you can move over to their competition in the next town. If the papacy is being a little tyrannical, you go up to Milan or south to Naples or down to Palermo, or just further into the papal states to Mantua or Rimini or Bologna, which are constantly rebelling. Okay, southern Italy, however, was different because of the Normans unifying southern Italy. At this point, in 1300, the Kingdom of Sicily was independent and belonged to the Spanish crown. And the blue is the French crown, the Anjou dynasty. Let's say you have all those fleur-de-lis on the... Recently, the Sicilians had kicked out the French, and so the French only had half of Italy. They'll soon lose the whole of it. Okay, and meanwhile, here's an image of the whole of Europe in the year 1300. There's a little bit of the Roman Empire still left. The Seljuk Empire has also fallen apart, and there are a whole bunch of different Turkish principalities competing with each other in central Anatolia. France is coalescing as a kingdom. Spain is now two kingdoms, as you know. We'll end up with Ferdinand and Isabella as the heirs, whose grandchild will become king of a unified Spain. Now, all of this was going along quite nicely when a little bit of bacteria incubated somewhere in the region of eastern Burma. And what was the catalyst? It wasn't the rat. It was the cause of the great bubonic plague, which would kill actually a third to almost half of the inhabitants of Europe eventually. It was the gerbil, the cute little gerbil in its blood incubated the bubonic plague, and then it was carried forward by fleas and lice onto human beings, and then through trade, basically, through the Silk Route that brought luxury goods to Europe. It arrived at the Black Sea, at this port in Crimea. From Crimea, it went to Constantinople, and then it went south, and then north. And here are all the different stages of the Black Death as it spread out year by year. So from around 1346 to 1353, the casualties of this pandemic were not evenly spread out. Certain towns and villages were completely wiped out. Other places lost maybe a fifth to a quarter of their population. So, how was it spread? Not simply by being bitten by a flea bite. It was also spread through bodily fluids, and worst of all, through the air. Somebody could breathe on you, and you would be dying 2 or 3 days later. So, this could have spelt the end of European civilization. Here is from the next century a rather haunting representation by Peter Bruegel the Elder entitled The Triumph of Death, to emblematically represent this horror. It never completely went away in the subsequent centuries, but what happened was actually fairly straightforward if you think about it. The people who were genetically disposed to survive it, their descendants had the genes to resist it. The people who were genetically not disposed to survive it were killed off pretty quickly, if not in the first, in the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth round. Okay, so that is the demographic cataclysm that effectively spells the end of the Middle Ages. So what does this do in practical terms? After the pandemic has more or less passed in its major initial phase, you have far fewer people than available work in all the countries of Europe. So, previous to the Black Death, people were tied in terms of being born into various occupations and social positions. So if you were going to be a goat herd, it's because your parents tended goats. If you were going to be a blacksmith, it's because your father was a blacksmith, and grandfather and great-grandfather. If you were just a peasant on the land, you were tied to the land. This completely destroyed that medieval structure. You had lots of work and fewer people. And this was very much the catalyst to the technological and demographic explosion that followed the Black Death for the remainder of the 14th into the 15th century, that culminated, as you know, in the 15th century with the Age of Exploration, and Europe eventually in just over a century coming to dominate the planet. Paradoxically, it was the horrific culling of the Black Death that was the dramatic agent of change. In this context, there was another agent of change. He's not as familiar to us anymore as Dante is, but his father knew Dante, and this is Petrarch. Petrarch was largely a poet, like Dante, but a poet with a very different sensibility. He was born in Arezzo. He moved eventually to Florence, and it was his sensibility that will ultimately guide the artistic sensibilities of both the writers, the artists, and the whole succeeding culture. It was Petrarch who first saw a huge gulf between his contemporary age and the Roman ancients. He was the person who coined the term the Dark Ages as standing between his time and the previous time. He was the person through his poetry who carved out, as it were, a semi-independent secular realm from the religious realm which was embodied in that great work of Dante's. So Petrarch is the key figure for the emerging Renaissance. So, likewise, contemporary, well, actually closely following the Black Death also was a calamity in the center of one of the two centers of authority in the West, papal authority. As I mentioned, in the earlier part of the century, the popes had moved to Avignon. They had moved to Avignon to escape the chaos that was Rome in the earlier part and the mid part of the 14th century, lots of reasons for that. Eventually, towards the last quarter, a pope returned. He sadly died shortly after his return. The new pope was actually a madman. He wasn't a zealous reformer. This is papal propaganda. And the cardinals, realizing what a terrible mistake they had made, they elected a new pope. So you had two popes. The new pope went back to Avignon, and so basically Europe was divided between not just two competing authorities, religious authority and secular authority, but two popes at the same time. This division lasted for actually more than 13 years, and it began to be healed in northern Italy by around 1414. So I'll introduce you to two imperial figures, the figures who were losing their authority. Here's a wonderful painting by Dürer of the last non-Habsburg emperor, the Emperor Sigismund. At the time, he was the emperor who convened the Council of Constance, and then he died during the council. And the pope that emerged out of that council, Martin V, very cleverly involved the second to last Roman emperor from the east and proposed a council to finally bring back together the Eastern and the Western Church. And this is a painting from the chapel in the Palazzo Medici, showing the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaeologus on his way to the Unity Council that was then being held in Florence. It's in the Catholic Church, it's called the 17th Ecumenical Council. It was largely through this council that the papal schism was resolved. Here are the various competing groups. So the people who belonged to the Roman popes were Northern Italy, Hungary, Poland, the former Vikings, and England. France, Spain, and Southern Italy, their pope was the Avignon Pope, and Germany was a mass split between both, vacillating one way or the other. Okay, so finally, this dramatic change was also embodied in the literary realm in the work of Boccaccio. His Decameron, as some of you might know, is actually a series of short novellas set in a villa above Florence during the time of a recurrence of the plague, when the aristocrats fled the city, went to their villas, and this is putatively the stories these aristocrats were telling each other to while their time while the plague took its course in the city of Florence. So this is the beginning of modern Western literature as well. Okay, so now we look at Italy in 1400 after the Black Death. Thanks to some energetic popes, largely the central Italian states have been more or less unified. Southern Italy is still split between a new French-derived dynasty, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Sicily. Northern Italy is slightly less, more than slightly less, divided. We do have the city-state of Florence, but notice what has happened. Milan, the Dukedom of Milan, is carving its own mini-empire, gobbling up much of northern Italy. The people who will ultimately unify Italy in the 19th century from Piedmont are carving out a rather generous principality. We have a mini French kingdom in Provence. Venice is expanding, but more or less central Italy is still a series of competing centers of authority and patronage. Meanwhile, in the east, as you can see, not much is left of the Roman Empire. It will be gone in 40 years. That's all that's left of Constantinople, just the area around Constantinople, and what is today's Peloponnese in today's Greece. Meanwhile, the new people on the block, coming out of a tiny little principality here, are called the Ottomans, after the founding person of the dynasty, and they have taken over most of Asia Minor, and they're both spreading north as well as east and south. Hungary is a large kingdom that is not long for this world. In the next century it will have vanished. Austria is emerging as one of the many parts of the Holy Roman Empire that will become Germany. And France is in one of its more coherent moments. The English will prevail again, but ultimately will be defeated. So, back to International Gothic. Here we see International Gothic now emerging into the 15th century. The date is 1420, and this is Florence, this is the Uffizi, and this is the mainstream artistic movement manifest at the moment of our revolution. So, on to the revolution. So, the first great artist of this revolution, undoubtedly, without any hesitation, we could say is Masaccio. Masaccio, actually very little is known about him. He comes from nowhere. He is given this extraordinary commission by the Brunelleschi family in their convent of Santa Maria of the Carmelites, and he paints this series of frescoes of the life of St. Peter. And what do we see here? He's certainly channeling something. Okay, we have the monumental style of the human figure that is being continued very much in the Giotto fashion, but we have a much more coherent spatial world which is suddenly opened up behind and amongst them. So here is a glimpse at this chapel. It's been somewhat compromised by later altars which were set up here, which obliterated whatever frescoes were in the center, but the side walls are largely intact, and we're going to look at these two paintings, the lower, the upper one, and this painting here. So as we turn around, this is the painting we just glanced at. We're going to look at this one and that one. So this is the Expulsion from the Garden. This painting will hugely influence the young Michelangelo, as you could anticipate from the opening slide. His Expulsion from the Garden is directly derived from Masaccio's Expulsion from the Garden. And here we have the other mystery painting, the Raising of the Son of Theophilus by St. Peter. Here we have St. Peter, the newly raised from the dead. And we're operating in a world where the stage set, as it were, of Giotto has expanded to create a much more large-scale stage set, not quite naturalistic yet, but there is more than a hint of one-point perspective operating here. This is a fabulous painting, because not only do you have St. Peter here, but on this side of the painting, which is not in the same time, although in the same space as this painting, you have some early 15th century figures in front of a fabric icon of St. Peter, see, same guy. And in this corner, you have four artists. And this is the painting which channels the revolutionary artists. Actually, there are four, you can barely see the fourth here. So, coming closer, this is Masaccio, the young Masaccio, who will sadly die in his 28th year, probably from malaria. He too made that terrible pilgrimage to central Italy, went to Rome, and caught a fever, as they say. And this is Brunelleschi, our hero, and the person who is the trigger for the artistic revolution. Painted in, probably not by Masaccio, but by the person who finished his paintings, Mausolino, because when Masaccio died, the chapel was largely unfinished. And the central figure, which will dominate the 15th century in many more ways than one, is Alberti. So, the first Renaissance painting, the undisputably first Renaissance painting, is Masaccio and Brunelleschi's Trinity. Now, in the textbooks, they'll tell you it's by Masaccio. This is nonsense. The whole setting is Brunelleschi architecture. It is a very successful, at least the architecture part, one-point perspective. The horizon point for the architecture is right here. It's at eye level. So we're looking up. Masaccio painted the figures. And he painted them in partially successful quasi-foreshortenings. Originally, there was a door, and there was a side door to the church, and so this whole painting was framed by the door as you entered through the side of the church. I don't believe there's a door there anymore. There's an altar. This is what it looks like today, behind all these little quasi-barriers. There you see it. So basically there was a door right here, which framed it, and the perspective resolves somewhere here as you approach halfway to the painting.
What cathedral is that?
This is Santa Maria Novella in Florence. So, what makes this painting revolutionary is not just that the geometrically coherent space is accurately represented, but that there are two vanishing points, not one. And this is also a painting actually contemporary by Masaccio, where he tries to show Christ in a foreshortened view along with St. John and the two Marys. Not the most successful representation, but the point is the intention. So if we look at this painting, and then look at the Trinity in Santa Maria Novella, what do you notice? Christ and the Father are not inhabiting the same perspectival space as the lower figures. So there are two vanishing points. There's one down here, and the Trinity actually has a vanishing point, probably somewhere at Christ's eye level. Now, this is a revolutionary moment, which will be carried forward partially by a couple of figures and a couple of paintings, but it'll take almost a century for its implications to be fully absorbed by the Italian artistic world. This is not my idea. I have a short bibliography at the end here for you. Okay, so here you see the geometry of the lower vanishing point a little bit. This allows one to reconstruct the volume of the painting, as you can see, and to position the figures in their correct position relative to each other. And so there we see them in their relative positions. Now, we know from other evidence, sadly not a surviving painting, but from literary evidence that it was in fact Brunelleschi who around about 10 years earlier produced the first accurate perspectival painting, in this case a two-point perspective. This is a recent by David Laguerre, circa the year 2000, recreation of what he imagines Brunelleschi's painting looked like. Brunelleschi's painting was a demonstration work. It was both a painting and a visual argument for perspectival realism. And here's a reconstruction of the mechanism that Brunelleschi created that we know from surviving literary evidence. So, this is the actual painting that Brunelleschi made. There was a hole in the middle, and the sky was a burnished silver. In other words, he turned it into a mirror. In front of this painting, he then positioned a mirror with another hole, a sight line. And what he's looking at is the baptistry. He's standing in the doors of the Duomo looking at the baptistry. And so, to see how accurate his perspective recreation of the view is, he will both lower and raise this mirror. So, if he sees the same thing through the eye hole, he knows that he's succeeded. And what allows the two to overlap are they're sharing the same sky. This was his demonstration, literally. In other words, he didn't just simply figure out one or 2 point perspective. He also demonstrated it to his fellow artists. The person who really picked this up, though, was Alberti, who arrives on the scene about 8 years later and ultimately writes his book on painting, where the first of the 3 books is a geometric mathematical explication of the same. Now, the great masterpiece that emerges out of this is by an unknown painter. It lives in the gallery in Urbino, in the palace in Urbino. It has been variously attributed to people like Piero della Francesca, Francesco Di Giorgio, Luciano Laurana, but we don't know who painted it. But essentially, this echoes in a more maybe pictorially advanced way Brunelleschi's painting. Without a scene, it's called the ideal city. It could represent the heavenly Jerusalem, hard to tell. However, Perugino produced a version of the same as the marriage of the Virgin. It's Christ giving the keys to St. Peter from the Sistine Chapel, from one of the many paintings on the side of the Sistine Chapel from the later 15th century. So this represents the temple in Jerusalem as an ideal building. And so what has he done? Are they actually inhabiting the same space? Not really. This is a frieze, which is operating only, not even persuasively in the foreground of this elaborate perspective. So here's another painting by Perugino. This is what happens when you surrender to spatial realism. And I gave a whole lecture about this last year. It's one of the ones that Eric will make accessible to you. It's called The Charms and Pitfalls of Perspectival Realism. So, in real space, this is what human beings look like. A charming scene by Perugino as well. Now remember, it's out of Perugino's Atelier that Raphael emerges. Just to remind you, Brunelleschi's revolution wasn't just in the realm of pictorial representation, it was in architecture. So circa 1420 is the beginning of his first building, the Ospitale, and the great engineering work of the dome of the Duomo, and ultimately his last 2 works are the lantern from the 1430s and early 1440s and the Tribune. But I'll return to those because they deeply influenced Michelangelo. But just to remind you, the first known work of Brunelleschi's is actually a sculpture, a relief sculpture. He didn't win the competition for the second set of bronze doors for the baptistry, but, well, he won a lot more. Okay, so briefly in closing, Masaccio, one of his late works. It's actually a fragment of a much larger work. Once again, these are much more compelling three-dimensional figures, occupying a much realer space than Giotto's, but along the same lines. And the monumentality of the human figure is embodied quite beautifully in this St. Andrew is for the same work. This fragment is now at the Getty Center in California. and there you see them in context. It was a large polytip. I can't pronounce the word. Anyways, a large-scale altar made of a large number of different paintings. A diptych and a triptych are obviously 2 and 3. So there's the St. Andrew up there, and there's that foreshortened crucifixion that we glanced at earlier. So the person who picks up the mantle of Masaccio fairly directly, he was a child when Masaccio died, is Piero della Francesca. Now this is from more or less the middle of his career, his resurrection. Now, it's less obvious in this abbreviated representation of the painting, which is mostly what you see in the textbooks. You have to see it fully in its frame. So Piero della Francesca paints the frame. Sadly, the frame has been damaged. It's partially restored here. But what I want to point out is that there are 2 vanishing points. The lower vanishing point is down here, as you can tell, right from the base of the columns. So that represents the vanishing point of the viewer as he looks up at the painting. The second vanishing point is you're looking straight across at Christ at eye level. So that dual compositional approach is represented very clearly in this masterwork of Piero della Francesca. So, what is happening here? As Alberti would say, as he will already have said, because his book on painting was already finished when Piero della Francesca did this painting, he says, the historia and the composition are one. In other words, the composition embodies the historia. And what is the historia that the composition is embodying, both in the Trinity and also in the resurrection, is that we are lifted up to God through Christ. It's explicit in the Trinity. It is Christ who is lifting us up to God the Father. Now you have to stand at a full-scale version of these paintings to feel it, but when you do, and when somebody's whispered this in your ear and you begin to see it, you will ultimately feel it as well. Okay, much more can be said about this. Another Piero della Francesca in the monumental form. This one you should all recognize. Do you recognize it? You should. It lives in the Frick on 5th Avenue. This is St. John the Evangelist. And it's at the end of that long axis of all 4 galleries. It terminates the long axis. As you can see, it's been cleaned and they left a portion of the uncleaned thing. And it was originally a part of another complex series of paintings, of which only 4 remain, and it was the subject of a major Piero della Francesca exhibit at the Frick 5 years ago. Did any of you go to that? I guess it was too early for most of you. You weren't here yet. There's a catalog, and so this is an image from that catalog. There were a number of Piero della Francescas, including this one. This one actually was probably the central painting of the exhibit. It was in the Oval Room in the center because it has recently been restored, so it was on display. It usually lives at the Clark Institute in Massachusetts, somewhere west of Boston. So, the monumental style. So, what am I alluding to? Well, fairly explicitly. The monumental style ultimately leads to the historia carried by the monumentalization of the human body as representing these non-human, rather divine beings. which in this case is the Madonna, the Child, and 4 angels. Another painting by Pier della Francesca, which makes the point even more emphatically. The Madonna of Mercy, it was also a part of a large-scale altar, of which it was originally the central panel. And here is, it's better preserved, at least the paintings are better preserved as a set, although the frame is absent. And rather than Gothic, you can tell by the arches that it's already early Renaissance. And one more, Pier della Francesca in the monumental mode. And finally, his culminating masterpiece. You have to go to Milan to see it. It's called the Montefeltro altarpiece, or the Brera Madonna. It was originally painted for the funerary chapel of the Dukes of Urbino in the church of, I'll get to that church. As the high altar painting. Unfortunately, when the French stole it during the Revolutionary Wars, they cut it down. So this is a reconstruction of the actual original dimensions of the painting. And this is a real crime. It's the Church of San Bernardino. Now, where it originally lived was right here. And why is that important? Because here's a view looking up at the church. Originally, the altar area was simply another apsidal space, which was later expanded. So it was a triconch, 3 niches. And if we go back to the painting, if we put our painting about here, there is one Renaissance sketch that shows it in situ. Unfortunately, it's nowhere on the internet, and our scanner was not working at the office, so I was unable to. Right? You see what I mean? There is another, the space of the church is expanded into the painting. So it's both, it both follows the structure of the church and takes you, as it were, through another frame into the real space that the church is just the threshold to, the transcendent space. A fantastic work of Pier della Francesca's. So, the person who takes up, and I will close here, the person who takes up Pier della Francesca's torch is, of course, Andrea Mantegna. This is his San Zeno altarpiece, fortunately intact and still living in its original setting in the convent church of San Zeno in Verona. And so, what are we looking at? So, see how the actual frame of the altarpiece is a part of the composition of the painting? Or in other words, the three-dimensionality of the altar, the framework of the painting, is a part of the spatial architecture of the painting. And it's 4 paintings, so 6 paintings rather than 3. And here we're looking at the crucifixion just below it. Again, operating very much, although at a smaller scale, in the monumental style. And just setting it in context. Here we see it, the altar is raised above the nave, and there you see it at the far end of the nave. And this, as you can see, it started out as a Romanesque church. It was completed when the Gothic altar was built, and then in the 15th century, this extraordinary painting was placed right there. This is in Verona. Yeah. Apparently, it's a part of the Romeo and Juliet tourist circle. It is said that Romeo and Juliet were married in the crypt below this altar. So you all know that Romeo and Juliet are fictitious, I hope. There was never... Oh yeah, I should say, perfect. Romeo and Juliet are a later Italian novella that Shakespeare then picks. Actually, it's, by the time he wrote his version, there had been 4 versions of this novella in Italian that he then turns into his peerless masterpiece. But at the core of it is this perpetual war in the city-states between the supporters of the popes and the supporters of the emperor. That's what these two families are quarreling about.
The Capulets and the Montagues.
Yeah, the Capulets and the Montagues. One of them is a Ghibelline, and the other is a Guelph. The Ghibellines were the Imperials, the Guelphs were the Papalists. And that's how poor Dante got expelled from Florence. He belonged to the Imperialist party, and so he was expelled. He got his ultimate revenge, though. He put the Pope that expelled him into the Inferno. So, okay, we can stop here. We'll pick up the childhood of Michelangelo. Next week, here is one more Mantegna, a fabulous apsidal painting where the apse is actually a pergola in a garden. Sadly, it's only a fragment of the original. It's not within its original frame, and this one lives in the Louvre. It's one of the ones that Napoleon took to France, and French didn't return, probably because there was nowhere to return it to. Okay, to be continued.